a frontier widow, a wounded enemy, and a night that would change both their lives forever. What happened inside that farmhouse before sunrise, and why did the soldiers really come back? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah Thornton's modest farmhouse as she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. October in northern Texas brought a chill that seemed to seep through the wooden walls of the home she had shared with her husband John before a Confederate bullet took him at Gettysburg. 5 years a widow at 27, Sarah had learned to manage alone, though loneliness was a constant companion. "Come on, Chester," she called to her aging border collie as she headed toward the barn to complete her evening chores. The dog padded faithfully behind her, his muzzle graying, but his eyes still alert. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, the familiar smell of hay and livestock greeting her. Chester suddenly stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Sarah whispered, reaching for the lantern hanging by the door. As she lit it, the warm glow illuminated the barn's interior, revealing nothing unusual at first glance. The 2 milk cows shuffled restlessly in their stalls, and Samson, her draft horse, nickered softly. Chester continued growling, his attention fixed on the back corner of the barn, behind a stack of hay bales. Sarah's heart quickened. Since her husband's death, she kept his Remington revolver tucked in her apron pocket, a necessity for a woman alone on the frontier. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm armed," silence answered her, but Chester wouldn't be deterred. He inched forward, hackles raised. Sarah followed, revolver now in hand. As she rounded the hay bales, she gasped. A man lay crumpled on the ground, blood seeping through a crude bandage wrapped around his torso. His long black hair was matted with dirt and blood, his bronze skin marking him unmistakably as Native American. The traditional clothing and distinctive paint patterns on his face identified him as Comanche, members of a tribe that had been engaged in bloody conflict with settlers and the U.S. Army for years. The wounded man's eyes fluttered open, dark, and filled with pain. He reached weakly for what appeared to be a knife at his waist, but lacked the strength to grasp it. "Don't," Sarah said, raising her revolver. "I don't want to hurt you." The man's hand fell away from the weapon, his eyes conveying a mixture of defiance and resignation. Sarah knew she should be terrified. The newspaper headlines and campfire stories were filled with accounts of Comanche raids on homesteads, of families slaughtered, women captured. Yet something in the man's eyes spoke of humanity rather than savagery. "You're hurt badly," she said, lowering her gun slightly. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should ride for the army outpost, 15 miles away. Captain Hawkins and his men had been scouring the area for weeks, hunting what they called hostile Indians who had allegedly attacked a stagecoach. But another voice, one that sounded remarkably like her father's, whispered differently. "Doctor." James Bennett had taught his daughter that healing knew no boundaries of race or creed. "The moment you decide who deserves mercy and who doesn't," he'd often said, "you stop being a healer." Sarah holstered the revolver and knelt beside the wounded man, who watched her warily. "I'm going to help you," she said clearly, knowing he likely wouldn't understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey her intent. "But you must not harm me or anyone else. Do you understand?" The man studied her face for a long moment before giving a slight nod. Then, grimacing with pain, he touched his chest and spoke a single word. "Tabe." "Tabe," Sarah repeated, recognizing it as his name. She touched her own chest. "Sarah." Checking his wound, she found a bullet had torn through his side, not immediately. Fatal, but serious enough without proper care. Infection had already set in. "I need to move you to the house," she said, knowing the barn was too cold and unsanitary. "Can you walk with help?" Tabe struggled to rise, determination evident in every line of his face. Sarah positioned herself under his arm, supporting as much of his weight as her frame could manage. Together, they made their way slowly toward the farmhouse as the sun disappeared behind the distant hills. Inside, Sarah helped Tabe onto the small cot in what had once been her father's examination room. The irony wasn't lost on her. A room where her father had sometimes secretly treated injured Native Americans was once again serving the same purpose. As she gathered supplies to clean and dress the wound properly, Chester barked suddenly, racing to the window. Sarah peered out into the gathering darkness and felt her blood freeze. In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled riders approaching, at least 6 or 7 men on horseback. By their formation and the glint of brass buttons caught in the last rays of sunlight, she knew immediately, U.S. Cavalry. Sarah looked back at the wounded Comanche warrior on her father's cot. She had minutes at most to decide what to do. Sarah's mind raced as the sound of hoofbeats grew closer. Looking at Taabe's weakened form on the cot, she made her decision swiftly. "You need to hide," she whispered urgently, though she knew he couldn't understand her words. She gestured frantically toward the trapdoor in the corner of the room, a small cellar her father had used to store medicines and occasionally to conceal runaway slaves during the war. Taab's dark eyes narrowed with suspicion, but when Sarah pointed toward the window, where the dust cloud of approaching soldiers was visible, understanding dawned on his face. He struggled to his feet, teeth gritted against the pain, and allowed Sarah to guide him to the trapdoor. "Be silent," she mouthed, pressing her finger to her lips as she helped him down the narrow steps. The cellar was barely large enough for a man to lie down, but it would have to suffice. She closed the trapdoor and quickly threw a rug over it, then pushed a small table on top for good measure. Sarah had just finished washing Taab's blood from her hands when a sharp knock rattled her front door. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened it to find Captain Hawkins and 5 of his men sitting astride their horses in her yard. The captain removed his hat, revealing prematurely gray hair that contrasted with his weathered face. "Evening, Mrs. Thornton," he said with the formal politeness he always adopted in her presence. "Sorry to disturb you after sundown." "Captain Hawkins," Sarah acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you and your men out at this hour?" "We're tracking a band of Comanche," he replied, his eyes scanning her property. "Hit a supply wagon yesterday about 10 miles south. 2 men dead, supplies stolen. Trail leads in this direction." Sarah forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, the half-truth burning in her throat. "Been working the farm all day." Captain Hawkins studied her face. Sarah had known him since she'd moved to the territory with John 7 years ago. He'd been kind to her after her husband's death, occasionally sending soldiers to help with heavier farm tasks, bringing supplies when winter storms made travel impossible. "Mind if we check your property, ma'am?" "Just to be thorough." Sarah hesitated, only briefly. Refusing would raise immediate suspicion. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. "Though I'd appreciate if you'd be quick about it. It's getting late." Hawkins nodded to his men. "Simmons, Peters, check the barn and outbuildings. Davis, the perimeter. Johnson and Miller with me." Sarah's heart pounded as the soldiers dispersed. Captain Hawkins and 2 men entered her home, their boots loud on the wooden floors. Chester growled softly as they passed. "Nice dog you got there." One of the younger soldiers, Miller, commented nervously. "He doesn't bite unless I tell him." "2," Sarah replied, with just enough edge to make the man step back. Captain Hawkins moved methodically through the house, checking each room with practiced efficiency. When they reached the examination room, Sarah held her breath as his boots passed directly over the hidden trapdoor. "Your father's old doctoring room," Hawkins remarked, glancing at the shelves of medical supplies. "You've kept it up." "Force of habit," Sarah said, "and it comes in handy for the occasional neighbor's injury." The captain nodded, seemingly satisfied, and they continued their search. When they returned to the main room, the other soldiers were already waiting. "Nothing in the barn, sir," Simmons reported. "Couple of cows, a horse, some chickens. No sign of anyone." "Perimeter's clear too," Davis added. Hawkins sighed, replacing his hat. "Well, Mrs. Thornton, seems you're in the clear, but I'd advise caution. These Comanche we're tracking are particularly dangerous. Led by a warrior they call Black Hawk. Vicious piece of work. Killed more settlers than I care to count." Sarah's stomach tightened at the name. The newspapers had been full of stories about Black Hawk and his band of warriors for months. Was Tabe one of them? I appreciate the warning, she said. I'll keep my doors locked and my husband's revolver close. We'll be camping at Willow Creek tonight, about 3 miles east, Hawkins said. If you see or hear anything suspicious, fire 3 shots in the air. We'll come running. Sarah nodded, escorting them to the door. As Hawkins mounted his horse, he hesitated. Mrs. Thornton. Sarah, I know you have your father's gentle heart, but these aren't the days for mercy toward the Comanche. They don't show any to our kind. Their eyes met, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he knew, that somehow he had sensed the wounded warrior beneath her floorboards. But then he tipped his hat and signaled to his men, and they rode off into the darkness. Sarah waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before rushing back to the examination room. She moved the table and rug and opened the trapdoor. Tabe lay at the bottom of the cellar, his face glistening with sweat, his breathing shallow. It's safe now, she whispered, helping him up. The effort of moving had reopened his wound. Blood seeping through the bandage, Sarah eased him back onto the cot and began properly cleaning and dressing his injury. The bullet had passed clean through his side, missing vital organs but leaving significant damage. Infection was the greatest danger now. As she worked, Tabe watched her intently. When she finished bandaging him, he grasped her wrist gently. With his free hand, he made a sweeping gesture toward the door, then pointed to himself, his expression questioning. Why did I hide you? Sarah interpreted. She considered how to communicate across their language barrier. Finally, she simply placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward him. Tabe's face remained impassive, but something in his eyes softened. He released her wrist and leaned back, exhaustion overtaking him. Sarah prepared a mixture of willow bark tea for the pain and fever, helping him drink it before she cleaned up the medical supplies. As she worked, her mind turned to Captain Hawkins' warning. If Tabe was one of Black Hawk's warriors, was she harboring a man responsible for the deaths of innocent settlers? Yet looking at him now, vulnerable in sleep, it was hard to see him, as the savage the newspapers described. Sarah remembered her father's words. Fear makes monsters of men. Look past it to see the truth. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. Sarah moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. By helping Tabe, she had placed herself in grave danger. If the army discovered him here, she would be considered a traitor, possibly even hanged. Dawn was still hours away, but Sarah knew that when morning came, difficult choices awaited her. For now, she settled into the rocking chair beside the cot, her father's revolver across her lap, keeping watch over the wounded warrior whose life she had chosen to save. Sarah woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping in the rocking chair. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains, and for a moment she was disoriented. Then her eyes fell on Tabe, and the events of the previous night came rushing back. The Comanche warrior was awake, observing her silently. His fever had broken during the night, a good sign, but his complexion remained pallid beneath his bronze skin. When their eyes met, he nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Morning, Sarah said softly, rising to check his bandages. The wound looked cleaner than the night before, the angry red edges beginning to fade. You're healing, she told him, knowing. He wouldn't understand the words, but hoping her tone conveyed the meaning. To her surprise, Tabe spoke, his voice rough but clear. Why help enemy? Sarah stepped back, startled. You speak English? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Some. Learn from captive, white teacher. 100 questions flooded Sarah's mind, but she focused on the one he had asked. I don't see an enemy. I see a wounded man. Tabe studied her face, searching for deception. Soldiers come back. Probably, Sarah admitted, moving to the window to scan the horizon. The land stretched empty in all directions, bathed in the golden light of early morning. But they won't find you if we're careful. She helped Tabe sit up and brought him a cup of broth and a piece of cornbread. He ate slowly, methodically, never taking his eyes from her face. You alone here? He asked finally. Sarah nodded. My husband died in the war. Back east. No children? A shadow crossed Sarah's face. We wanted them. It wasn't meant to be. Tabe seemed to understand the grief behind her simple words. He touched his chest. My woman, my son, dead, smallpox, 2 winters past. The shared loss hung between them, a bridge across their vastly different worlds. Sarah realized that despite everything that should divide them, race, culture, the bloody history between their peoples, they were united by the universal language of loss. I'm sorry, she said simply. You doctor? Tabe asked, gesturing to the medical supplies. My father was. He taught me. Sarah began gathering fresh bandages. I need to change your dressing again before I go out to tend the animals. As she worked, Tabe gradually revealed more about himself through his limited English. He was indeed part of Black Hawk's band, but he spoke of their actions differently than the newspapers did. To Tabe, they were fighting to protect their hunting grounds, their way of life, their very existence against an ever-encroaching tide of white settlers. Land was Comanche for many generations, he explained. Now white man comes, kills buffalo, builds fences. Not all settlers want to destroy your way of life, Sarah countered gently. Some just want a place to raise their families in peace. Peace? Tabe's expression hardened. White man speaks of peace while taking our land. Sarah couldn't argue with the truth of his words. She had seen the broken treaties, the false promises, the gradual pushing of native peoples from their ancestral lands. Their conversation was interrupted by Chester's warning bark from outside. Sarah rushed to the window, her heart racing. Through the morning mist, she could make out riders approaching from the east, Captain Hawkins and his men returning as promised. They're coming back, she whispered, turning to Tabe. Can you make it to the cellar? Tabe struggled to his feet, significantly stronger than the night before, but still weak. Why you risk for me? He asked as she helped him toward the trapdoor. Soldiers find me, you hang. Sarah paused, the question catching her off guard. Why was she risking everything for this man? A Comanche warrior, who by his own admission, had fought against settlers like her. My father believed all life has value, she said finally. He taught me to heal, not to judge who deserves healing. Tabe held her gaze for a long moment. Your father, wise man. They had just closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug when a knock came at the front door. Sarah smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. Captain Hawkins stood on her porch, his expression grim. Morning, Mrs. Thornton. Sorry to disturb you again. Captain, Sarah acknowledged, acutely aware of the armed soldiers behind him. What brings you back so soon? Found fresh blood on a trail leading this direction, he said bluntly. And one of my trackers spotted what looks like moccasin prints mixed with a woman's boot prints near your barn. Sarah felt her mouth go dry. She had been so careful when helping Tabe from the barn to the house, but in the darkness, she must have missed something. I killed a coyote yesterday, she improvised. It was after my chickens. Dragged the carcass out back to burn it later. Perhaps that's the blood your men found. Hawkins's eyes narrowed slightly. Mind if I see this coyote, ma'am? Sarah's mind raced. I already burned it this morning before tending to my chores. That's so. Hawkins didn't bother hiding his suspicion now. Mrs. Thornton, Sarah, I've known you since you and John settled. Here, you've always been an honest woman. If you're hiding something or someone, now would be the time to tell me. Sarah held his gaze steadily. I have nothing to hide, Captain. Hawkins sighed heavily. Then you won't mind if my men conduct a more thorough search of your property. This time, we'll be checking every nook and cranny. Sarah's heart pounded, but she stepped aside. Do what you must. The soldiers spread out with more purpose than the night before. 2 headed for the barn, others began checking outbuildings, while Hawkins and the tracker, a half-Mexican man named Gonzalez, entered the house. Nice place you keep, Mrs. Thornton, Gonzalez remarked, his eyes scanning everything with professional assessment. Sarah had heard rumors that Gonzalez had been raised among Comanches before joining the army as a scout. If anyone could detect Tabe's presence, it would be him. They moved methodically through the house, checking closets, looking under beds. When they reached the examination room, Gonzalez paused, his nostrils flaring slightly. Medicine smells strong in here. he commented, moving toward the center of the room where the trapdoor lay hidden beneath the rug and table. My father's old examination room, Sarah explained, fighting to keep her voice steady. I still use his remedies for neighbors sometimes. Gonzalez nodded, but his eyes narrowed as he scanned the floor. He moved toward the rug, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Suddenly, Chester began barking frantically outside, followed by a shout from one of the soldiers. "Captain! Tracks heading north, past the creek bed." Hawkins and Gonzalez exchanged glances before hurrying outside. Sarah followed, her legs feeling strangely weak. In the yard, one of the soldiers was pointing excitedly toward a line of trees bordering the northern edge of her property. "Fresh tracks, sir, not more than an hour old." Gonzalez crouched, examining the ground. "Comanche, all right. Moving fast, but favoring one side. He's wounded." Hawkins turned to Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Seems our quarry passed through your property without your knowledge, Mrs. Thornton. Lucky for you." Sarah managed a nod, relief washing over her. "As I said, I haven't seen anyone." "Mount up, men," Hawkins ordered. "We can catch him if we move quickly." As the soldiers prepared to ride out, Hawkins approached Sarah one last time. "I'll be stationing 2 men at your place until we return," he said. "For your protection, of course." Sarah's blood ran cold. "That's really not necessary, Captain." "I insist," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Johnson, Miller, you two remain here. Keep Mrs. Thornton safe until we return." The 2 young soldiers nodded, dismounting as the rest of the unit galloped north, following the false trail. Sarah watched them go, her mind racing. Tabe was still hidden beneath her floorboards, and now she had 2 armed soldiers watching her every move. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, promising a long, dangerous day ahead. The 2 soldiers, Johnson and Miller, made themselves comfortable on Sarah's porch, rifles across their knees. Johnson, the older of the 2, was taciturn and watchful. Miller, barely 20 by Sarah's estimation, seemed nervous and eager to please. "Ma'am, is there any chance we could trouble you for some coffee?" Miller asked as the morning wore on. "Been riding since before dawn." Sarah seized the opportunity. "Of course. Why don't you both come into the kitchen? I just baked bread yesterday. Inside." Sarah busied herself with the kettle, her mind working furiously. Tabe had now been hidden in the cramped cellar for hours. She needed to create a diversion that would allow her to check on him and perhaps provide him with water and food. "You boys been with Captain Hawkins long?" she asked conversationally as she set cups on the table. 3 years for me," Johnson replied curtly. "Miller here joined up after Washita." Sarah had read about the Battle of Washita in the newspaper, a controversial attack on a Cheyenne village by Colonel Custer that had resulted in the deaths of women and children. She glanced at Miller, who shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "My brother was killed by Comanches," Miller offered by way of explanation. "Farmstead in Kansas. I joined up to make sure it doesn't happen to other families." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry about your brother." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Johnson interjected, "but Captain Hawkins mentioned you living out here alone since your husband passed. Ain't safe for a woman, especially with hostiles about." "I manage," Sarah replied, pouring coffee. As she reached for the sugar, she deliberately knocked over the flour canister, sending white powder billowing across the kitchen floor. "Oh, how clumsy of me." "Let me help with that, ma'am," Miller offered, jumping to his feet. "No need," Sarah said quickly. "But if you wouldn't mind fetching some water from the well, this will take a bit of cleaning." Miller nodded eagerly and headed outside with the bucket. Johnson remained seated, watching Sarah carefully as she began sweeping up the flour. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I just remembered I have some apple pie left from yesterday. It's in the spring house out back. Would you care for a slice with your coffee?" Johnson's stern expression softened slightly. "That would be mighty kind, ma'am." "I'll just be a moment," Sarah promised, setting aside the broom and heading out the back door before he could offer to accompany her. Once outside, Sarah hurried toward the spring house, a small stone structure built over a natural spring that kept perishables cool. She did indeed have a pie there, but retrieving it wasn't her primary purpose. As she neared the corner of the house, She ducked around to the examination room window instead. Tapping softly on the glass, she whispered, "Tabe, can you hear me?" There was no response. Sarah glanced around nervously, then tried again, slightly, louder. After a moment, she heard a faint scratching from inside. Tabe had heard her. "Soldiers still here," she whispered. "Stay hidden. I'll try to help you escape tonight." She wasn't sure if he could understand her through the closed window, but she had to hope. Quickly retrieving the pie from the spring house, she returned to the kitchen where both soldiers now waited, Miller having returned with the water. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Sarah kept the soldiers occupied with meals and conversation, all while her mind raced through possible escape plans. By late afternoon, there was still no sign of Captain Hawkins and the others returning. "They must have followed that trail quite a distance," Sarah remarked as she prepared supper. Johnson grunted. "Captain's determined to catch this bunch. They've been raiding settlements all through the territory." As the sun began to set, Sarah noticed both soldiers growing increasingly uneasy. "Something wrong?" she asked. Miller and Johnson exchanged glances. "Captain should have been back by now," Johnson admitted. "Or at least sent word." "Perhaps they made camp for the night," Sarah suggested, hope rising within her. If the soldiers left to look for their captain, she could help Tabe escape. Johnson shook his head. "Captain's orders were clear. We stay, put until he returns." As darkness fell, Sarah lit lamps and excused herself to her bedroom, claiming fatigue. Instead of sleeping, however, she changed into darker clothing and quietly gathered supplies: food, water, bandages, and a small pouch of money she kept hidden in a flour tin. She was startled by a soft knock at her bedroom door. "Mrs. Thornton?" Miller called. "Everything all right? We heard movement." "Just preparing for bed," Sarah called back, quickly hiding the supplies under her quilt. "Good night, gentlemen." "Night, ma'am," came the reply. Sarah waited, listening as the soldiers settled on her porch for the night watch. One would sleep while the other kept guard, she imagined. She needed to wait until the deepest part of night, when whoever was on watch might grow drowsy. Hours passed. The house creaked and settled in the cooling night air. Finally, around midnight, Sarah crept from her bedroom, the bundled supplies tucked under her arm. Moving silently through the darkened house, she made her way to the examination room. The floorboards protested softly as she crossed to the hidden trapdoor. Pausing to listen for any reaction from the soldiers outside, she carefully moved the table and rug, then lifted the trapdoor. "Tabe," she whispered into the darkness below. The Comanche warrior emerged from the cellar like a shadow, his movements fluid despite his injury. In the dim moonlight filtering through the window, his eyes gleamed with a mixture of pain and determination. "Soldiers?" he asked softly. "On the porch," Sarah replied, handing him the bundle. "Front and back. We need to go through the window." Tabe nodded, understanding immediately. He helped Sarah slide the examination table beneath the window, then stood upon it to unlatch the frame. With surprising gentleness for his size, he eased the window open without a sound. Sarah pointed toward the tree line beyond her property. "The creek leads to a cave system about 2 miles south," she whispered. "You can hide there until you're stronger." Tabe turned to her, his expression questioning. "You come?" Sarah hesitated. If she disappeared, the soldiers would immediately sound the alarm. Captain Hawkins would know she had helped Tabe escape. Everything she had built here, her home, her life, would be forfeit. "I can't," she said finally. "They would hunt us both." Understanding dawned in Tabe's eyes. He placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture conveying more than words could. Then, to Sarah's surprise, he removed something from around his neck, a small leather pouch on a cord. "Protection," he said, placing it in her palm and closing her fingers around it. "From my people." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the night's stillness. Both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Captain's back," Sarah whispered urgently. "You must go now." Tabe nodded, quickly slipping through the window with a grace that belied his injured state. Sarah followed, helping to ease the window closed behind them. They crouched beneath the sill as voices carried from the front of the house. Johnson and Miller greeting the returning soldiers. "Did you find him, Captain?" Miller's eager voice rang out. "Lost the trail at the river," came Hawkins's frustrated reply. "But we found something else. Signs of a larger band moving east. Must have been a scout we were tracking." Sarah and Tabe exchanged glances in the darkness. They had only moments before the soldiers might check on her. "Go," Sarah urged, pointing toward the shadows of the tree line. "Stay low." Tabe grasped her hand briefly. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that transcended their language barrier. Then he was gone, a shadow melting into shadows. Sarah waited until he had disappeared into the darkness before carefully making her way around to the back door of her house. She had just slipped inside when a knock came at her bedroom door. "Mrs. Thornton?" Captain Hawkins called. "Sorry to wake you, but we've returned." Sarah quickly mussed her hair and rubbed her eyes before opening the door, feigning sleepiness. "Captain? What time is it?" "Past midnight, ma'am. Just wanted to let you know we're back. Found signs of a larger Comanche party heading east. We'll be moving out at first light to intercept them." Sarah nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you for letting me know." Hawkins studied her face for a moment. "You all right, Mrs. Thornton? Seem a bit flushed." "Just startled from sleep," she replied. "Will you be needing anything before you rest?" The captain shook his head. "We're fine, thank you. Get some sleep, Sarah. We'll be gone before sunrise." As promised, the soldiers departed before dawn, the thunder of hoofbeats fading into the distance as first light touched the eastern horizon. Sarah stood on her porch watching until they disappeared from view. The leather pouch Tabe had given her clutched tightly in her hand. Moving to the examination room, she gazed out the window toward the tree line where Tabe had vanished into the night. There was no sign of him as she expected. He would be miles away by now, making his way back to his people. Sarah opened the small leather pouch, finding inside a beautifully carved bone pendant depicting an eagle in flight, a symbol of freedom perhaps, or of the spirit that had connected them despite everything that should have kept them apart. The morning sun rose fully, bathing her small farm in golden light. Sarah knew that helping Tabe could have cost her everything, yet she felt no regret. In a world torn by hatred and fear, she had chosen compassion, just as her father would have done. She tied the leather cord around her neck, tucking the pendant beneath her dress where it rested against her heart. Outside, life continued. Cows needed milking, eggs needed gathering, fields needed tending. Sarah stepped out into the new day, carrying with her the knowledge that even in the darkest times, humanity could still bridge the chasms that divided people. And somewhere to the south, a wounded Comanche warrior carried with him a similar understanding, that mercy knew no boundaries, that kindness could be found in the most unexpected places, and that perhaps there was still hope for peace in this troubled land.